Hey everybody, Yule here. Today we're going to talk about Doom Patrol number 19 by Grant Morrison and Richard Case. But first, let's talk a little bit about Fantastic Comics, your local comic book store in Berkeley, California that will one day reopen as soon as this whole COVID thing plays out the way we all hope it will play out. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll all be able to stop our shelter in place, come out, buy some comic books, go out and see a movie. Although things right now aren't looking so good on both of those fronts, because just recently we've seen AMC is rumored to potentially be going bankrupt, probably closing down. There's not going to be movies coming out in quite a while. Some are in the can, but if this sickness keeps going on longer, if people aren't going out and seeing movies, then the studios are going to have to figure out a new way to distribute those. And going to movie theaters just might not be the thing we want to do after this social distancing stuff that we've been going through. Not only that, people are getting used to seeing stuff at home, not leaving the house, getting things delivered to them. I just don't know where retail is going to be going forward. But thankfully, Todd Mcfarlane has stepped in and said a few things. He had an interview with Forbes. In the article, he talks about things that he would do. You should all go and check this out if you have the time. It's a very interesting read, but one of the things I want to point out is that Todd thinks that when we finally come back, you should take the 90% of the market, which is Image, Dark Horse, Marvel, and DC. Truthfully, it's just Marvel and DC, but Image and Dark Horse can play along. He recommends that these publishers get 10 of their new top-tier titles. So you're talking like Batman and Spider-Man, and probably Jeff Lemire comic books for for Dark Horse, and his Black Hammer series, and you make those free. You make them available for free digital downloads and try and grow the business, because if you aren't taking a look at digital going forward, because we've seen how Diamond's distribution, if they close, there are no new comics. There are no distributors to put out new comic books. So there has to be an attack going forward so that people can get comics, so that new people know there are comics, and lapsed fans know that they still can get their stuff just digitally. And if that were to happen, it might actually drive people back to the comic stores, because just like the movie theaters, when are discretionary funds going to be available to a lot of people going forward? People have lost jobs. People have been furloughed. They've been getting unemployment, but if they have to still pay rent in states where it's going to be mandatory, or if they have to pay back rent because they aren't paying right now, and then there's food, and then there's, health concerns and all that other stuff that goes on, when are people going to come in and buy comic books? When are people going to buy, video games, all that stuff? And are they even going to go to a store in order to make that happen? So that's why the digital is so important for, or at least that's what Todd Mcfarlane is saying, for the health, for the continual success of the industry. We have to move forward. And paper is not always that way, even though there is resistance. I'm a person who resists it. We've seen in other videos where I've talked about how I will not read digital comics. But there is a time sometimes when I start jonesing, and I know there was that Spider-Man that we didn't get in because we closed down early. I want to read that issue. Will I succumb to the digital means? I don't think so. But other people will. And it's not necessarily a bad thing for comic stores. A lot of comic stores do not embrace digital because they feel that it's hurting their business. But if it can bring 1, 2, 5, 10, maybe even a lot more people back into the comic store to get back issues, to get, just the love of the merchandise that, people like it back in their hands, maybe it will. I don't know. I just feel like sometimes people don't even realize comic books are even out there. Sometimes stores are few and far in between. And since they're not on shelves of like 7-Elevens and liquor stores and there's been Walmart lately where they've had DC Comics and they have other people that are coming in and bringing comic books. But that's not necessarily a methodology that you don't really want to get everybody reading from those stands, because those companies are not equipped, and they're not really interested in dealing with comic books the way comic book stores are. And the other thing about comic stores coming in that you don't get from digital is you get the companionship, you get the camaraderie, you get the conversation about comic books, and you get a comic book store owner or employee that actually enjoys the material, and I say shill, but I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean, they are there to excite you, to try and get you to pick something up. Not because they're trying to make money, but because we're trying to share our love of comic books to the other people. So we should not always be afraid of digital. The one thing I'll say about this 10 free titles, I personally have gone on other YouTube shows and with other store owners, and my big thought was that when we finally come back in, there's going to be a surplus of comic books that are built up that Diamond has in storage that are going to go to the stores, probably doled out weekly as if they were coming out normally. But because comic companies have told creators pencils down, comic books aren't being created right now. There is going to be a gap in between the last of the stuff that's been stockpiled until the first of the new books. And I personally think that wait is going to be a killer to get new books in for the customers. The last thing we really need is people to think that they don't need comic books. I've 6 months. It's not that big a deal. I guess I won't come back. So what I personally think is, on top of the 10 free digital downloads that Todd Mcfarlane is suggesting, I really think Marvel and DC need to bite the bullet, consider it as advertising for not only their comic books, but also for their movie products, their IPs that they put out there. And they have to make a deal with comic stores, kind of like Free Comic Day, where we pay for the shipping, but they give us the comic books for free. If they were to do that, then the stores can either transfer the books to people that don't have money so that they can get the books in their hands for free. They can decrease the price of the original comic book so that anybody could get it. Or then they can make extra money on people that are able to pay full price for a comic book, and that will help comic stores going forward. It won't put money in Marvel and DC's pockets, but if they care about the industry going forward, then that's how I think it would be an olive branch to comic stores everywhere if that were to happen. It would create a situation where there isn't haves and have-nots in the comic book store community, as opposed to a big store that has multiple shops, or a small far away from a big city comic store. And we could get back on our feet, because think about all the rent that we are going to have to pay going forward on a store that hasn't been open during this time. And again, someone's got to bite the bullet on this. Marvel and DC, since they're owned by giant conglomerate corporations that are hurting, Disney is hurting. They have so many properties, and now it's not just making movies. It's their parks, it's their hotels, it's their cruise lines. All these things aren't making them money anymore, and things are sinking. So I know it's a hard Band-Aid to want to rip off, to give things to people for free. But if you are trying to excite people in a time when there is no excitement, I personally think that's the way to go. The digital is nice, but if we want people back in stores, let's give them comics for free. Doom Patrol number 19 came out in 1989. It originally cost $1.50. And as you can see by the cover, it was part 1 of 4. This was the first issue of Grant Morrison's classic run. It is penciled mostly throughout by Richard Case, and unlike comic books today, this didn't start over with a brand new #1 issue. It just kept on going. The previous 18 issues were written by Paul Kupperberg with a couple of different artists, Steve Lytle and Eric Larson. These illustrators didn't really seem to respect Paul Kupperberg's writing and often would change or balk at stuff that he wrote. Doom Patrol originally got their start in My Greatest Adventure number 80 in June of 1963. Often, people consider Doom Patrol the predecessor to X-Men. They have strange, uncanny, tortured stories that are very reminiscent of how we picture the X-Men to be. There was only a few months in between the first issue of Doom Patrol in My Greatest Adventure and X-Men #1, so they probably weren't totally influenced by each other any more than any other comic book. A good case in point to consider is the Fantastic Four created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came out in 1961. Challengers of the Unknown, created by Jack Kirby, came out from DC in Showcase number 6 in February of 1957. The similarities between the two teams were very apparent, and of course, Jack Kirby, the King, was involved with both of them. So, things that are similar, things that are direct lifts coming from one company and going to another is not an uncommon thing. I just don't think the Doom Patrol is as closely related to the X-Men as some people lead others to believe. Grant Morrison is a super polarizing creator. Usually people either really like him or really hate him. There is very little in between when considering his career. Morrison is a Scottish writer who first gained critical and financial success with Batman Arkham Asylum graphic novel. Before that, he worked in the usual British-type magazines like 2000 AD. He created his own book called Zenith with Steve Yeowell. I hope I'm saying that right. And then he has also worked at Marvel and DC, but mostly his career in the mainstream has been at DC. His first work when he came over here was Animal Man, which again met with a lot of success critically. I don't think the sales were as great as all that, but definitely it was a book that you can look to and see exactly where he's going. He can do a mainstream superhero comic book and bring in family situations, and yeah, it's just really great. So if you have never read Animal Man, you should check that out. But it's his work on Doom Patrol that I'm really interested in letting you know about, and it's some of my favorite comic book stuff, probably because of my age at the time. I was 18, and I was looking for something that just wasn't superhero always, all the time, and the Doom Patrol is such a perfect fit, because in the 90s, the X-Men were, blowing up. They weren't the way they always were. Still a great series. Chris Claremont doing great stuff with different illustrators. But when you're looking for something just a little extra, you have to go outside the normal means. And that's where Grant Morrison comes in. He brings that element of differentness, oddness, just something that you don't normally see. And he can actually put it into a mainstream comic book like Doom Patrol. Well, that's fantastic. All right, Doom Patrol number 19 starts off with a car race. What is this, like Formula One type stuff or something? Anyway, the character that we're witnessing in this race is Cliff Steele. For those of you that don't know who Robot Man is, here's your introduction to the character. His car, he loses control of it, it explodes, and then here you see him coming out. This is a metaphor, because he wakes up screaming. So what happened in that crash was only his brain was preserved, and it was put into a robot body. And this is torturing him. And he has been hanging out in an asylum recently. This is an event that takes place right after the last issue, as, issues do. 18, then 19. And the events that happened in the last issue, certain characters died, and this is kind of giving us a fresh start to get to know the characters again, to let Grant Morrison get us sucked into the characters, and hopefully the story going forward. Anyway, Cliff Steele, Robot Man, is not having any of it. All right here, Grant Morrison is introducing us to Niles Calder, the chief. He's the dude in the wheelchair. He got the original Doom Patrol together, and there was a moment where it looked like he died, and so as the new series, that the previous 18 issues, his young bride was trying to find him because she had believed that he was alive. As you see here, he is. But she unfortunately died at the end of that issue, which is kind of one of the situations that put Cliff into his mental state. And here Niles is talking to Joshua, trying to get the Doom Patrol back together again. And Joshua's like talking about how, Larry, which is Negative Man, and Robot Man, and they're just having like all these crazy situations with their minds and everything that are going on. And he's like, maybe you should just lay back, and let Cliff, Robot Man, deal with his stuff. And he's like, no, don't worry about that. Niles is like, I got someone that will help him. And he's all, dang, you're an Iceman. And Niles is like cool with that. Anyway, Joshua is like talking about not joining the Doom Patrol. He doesn't want to, and this is a whole scene where, the chief is trying to get him together and, let us know about everything that's going on. And then as that scene ends, we are introduced to the person who's going to help Robot Man with his situation, and that's Will Magnus. Will Magnus is the guy that made the Metal Men. That's a classic DC superhero team, if you're into like that old stuff. And of course he would be the person to come and talk to a man in a robot suit, and he can really maybe bring him back into the fold, so he'll go back to being a superhero. And he's really pleasant. He's getting Robot Man to warm up to him, or at least you think he is. And I like this panel here where it's just this long pull-out shot where you just see them all in the room. It's sparse. There's almost nothing going on. And then here's the reaction that Cliff Steele has for Magnus. And this is to let you know, this is not a comics approved comic book, a Comic Authority approved comic book. This is the first issue that dropped it within the Doom Patrol series. So this is the extent of what you can get through in 88, 89. And Cliff Steele is, none too happy hanging out with Magnus either. And that's his reaction. Now we're in a hospital where we're seeing Larry Trainor. And, he's kind of living a pretty good life, reading a book in the hospital, just kind of hanging out. It deals with the Hero Gene storyline that happened in a mini-series event called Invasion, which is right prior to this storyline. And so this is, Grant Morrison keeping the Doom Patrol. There's actually, DC never had a problem keeping their mystical and strange superheroes or comic books in the superhero world. They always had a way to make like Swamp Thing part of the superhero universe. And even Shade the Changing Man, which was like really trippy, that could have easily been part, you could imagine seeing Batman. And then that's what this is going on. This whole big crazy event that was going on is affecting this character also. And then Larry is visited when he's alone, and this is the negative man specter that creates, lets him become a superhero, so to speak. And here it's like taking, threatening him. And then let's move back to Cliff Steele and Magnus. And Magnus is just trying to convince him, things aren't as bad as you make them out to be. And remember, this is 88, 89. Here he is talking about antidepressants and stuff to help him going along. And Cliff is like, no, this is crazy. Look at me. And this is a horrifying scene. But what he's trying to convey is that even though he feels pain inside, he can't feel it physically. And here he is just sobbing, wanting to make everything stop. And Magnus can just only look on. Back at the hospital where Larry Trainor is, he's being attacked. He calls for help. And then he's told that that's exactly what this guy wanted to have happen. He needs the nurse to come in. He's like, what are you talking about? There has to be an alchemical marriage between these two people. And here he is attacked. And there's a big explosion. And as his doctor comes in, she is subsumed into the negative man character. And then here we go back to Magnus and Cliff. And there's some nice little spots in this page here that are part of the story to come. Not as important right this moment, but it will play out. This is, again, Cliff just being hounded by Magnus that it isn't as bad as he thinks. And then finally, he says, if you... Magnus is like, I'm sick of this self-indulgent crap that you're going through. You got to get over this. I mean, this is not becoming. And he's like, there's people with way worse problems with you. And he's, all right, fine, show me one. And that's when Magnus takes him outside. And that's where we meet crazy Jayne. She has 64 separate personalities, each of them with some sort of crazy power. This is all because of that whole invasion gene bomb thing that happened in that miniseries we were talking about. And here she's painting. And the painting attacks Cliff. And there's this nice little conversation that they have. And Cliff is realizing as she's opening up, as the rain comes down, as her painting is dissolving, there is somebody that's worse off than him. And they just stand there. And then finally he says, coming out of the rain. And it's like he's accepting his fate. And wow, it's so super powerful. And then here we have the end of this issue, which is going to take us into the Scissormen story. It's actually, the Scissormen story. Everybody knows it as that. And a wreck happens, and from the wreck comes a flaming, fleshy skeleton proclaiming that the Scissormen are coming. And then here we have this Men in Black guys. He's all, I'm sick of this Men in Black stuff. And he's all, it's not an act. And then they're talking about, what you do when you have an emergency. He's all, it's all out of our hands. All we have to do is call the company. The company calls the Pentagon. The Pentagon calls the president. And he calls Niles Calder. And that's the reason why the Doom Patrol need to be around. And that's the beginning of a fantastic 56 issue storyline that Grant Morrison brings us. If you are into fun action superheroes that are trippy, that you're going to learn something that you might not ever want to learn, that's all in this freaking comic book. I love it. And it's got great covers. Later on, you're going to get some Bisley stuff. And I highly recommend it. As an extra add-on, I wanted to spotlight the fact that there's a letters column in this comic book. I really appreciate the fact, especially these days since you hardly get at letters pages anymore, you don't get them in trade paperbacks or collections of comic books. You can only go to the past in order to get these, as far as I know. And this one has 4 pages dedicated to that. There are some commercials on them, which is kind of cool also. I always felt like when I read a comic and I wanted to read it again, I wanted to find something else that wasn't in there. And, eventually you go to the letters columns. And there's sometimes some pretty educated readers. And when you get to a Grant Morrison comic, so in a couple months, we're going to get his readers adjusting to this comic book. And it's pretty good. There's the letters column is going to be like one of the best written letters columns there's out there. And I really think it's a shame that we don't see more of them in comics these days. We've gone to an online format or a social media format. but a well-crafted letter. And, the companies can still choose what they filter in and out of those, how much criticism they're actually willing to take and whatnot. But it's there in print, whatever is chosen. And it's something that people would actually have conversations back and forth within the letter columns. And again, it's just so sad that we don't get it that way anymore. Thank you, everybody, for listening to me ramble about Doom Patrol and the comic book industry. If you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up at the bottom of this page. If you have a comment or something you want to suggest to us to maybe review in the future, leave it down in the bottom. As always, you can find us on social media just by typing in Fantastic Comics. We have a Patreon page. If you enjoyed this a lot, you might want to give us $1 or more. We appreciate everything, and we'll see you next time. Bye.